Monday night, people flooded the streets of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, in celebration for yet another Roll Tide championship victory. But this time, 14 people were arrested for partaking in this seemingly harmless event. You see, during any other year, this would be a time of great celebration and joy where nobody would be arrested unless they were provoking violence. However, ever since the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States and has affected all of us in different ways, seemingly harmless celebrations have resulted in fights between various groups. Social media is yet again debating whether or not these celebrations should have been allowed, especially during a time of a pandemic, and as a result, fights broke out during these celebrations over this debacle. Furthermore, this proves my point that this college football season was very close to not being played at all. It is miraculous that we were able to complete an entire season without any major problems along the way. This mini documentary serves to recognize how Alabama was able to accomplish so much during such a difficult time for our nation. Before we get into this video, listen to this quick announcement. Are you an athlete in need of a highlight tape? Do you have clips but don't know how to mix them? SC Highlights is the place for you. Follow our Instagram at SC Highlights and send us a DM asking for a tape. You can also DM to have your own personalized cartoons. Send us a message and we'll let you know our pricing. The Alabama Crimson Tide has been one of the most dominant teams in the nation since its beginnings, with 18 national championships and a 73.1% winning percentage. The team has a long list of storied players, as they have had 144 first-team All-Americans. Since the Nick Saban era began in 2007, the Crimson Tide have only lost 23 games. If you don't include his first season, when he took over halfway through, they have only lost 17 games. However, Alabama had not always been this dominant, and in order to assess this team accurately, we must go back over 130 years. From their first season in 1892 up until 1923, the Crimson Tide went through 15 head coaches, resulting in a majority of winning seasons. In 1923, a relatively good team became great with the hiring of Wallace Wade. The former Vanderbilt assistant coach posted a 15-0 record with just 2 ties in his 2 seasons in Nashville. He used this winning experience to lead Alabama to being crowned national champions 3 times, with a 61-13 record overall. During this era, the NCAA did not decisively choose a national champion, and it was left to various media polls to decide. Since Wade's teams were undefeated in those 3 seasons, they were named the national champions. After his 3rd national championship victory during a season where Bama outscored opponents 271-13, Wade surprisingly announced he would become the new head coach at Duke. Apparently, he left because he thought Duke, being a private school, would allow him greater freedom for what he was allowed to do in terms of coaching. Wade established a new culture and a tradition of winning into the Alabama football team that continues to be seen today. He brought a sense of pride and hope to the state of Alabama at a time where they were suffering from severe poverty and political turmoil. Frank Thomas became the new head coach and picked up right where Wade left off, winning 2 national championships. Wide receiver Don Hutson helped lead the team to a 1934 national title after finishing the season with 326 yards and 3 touchdowns. Hudson then went on to have one of the greatest careers as a receiver, as he consistently led the NFL in all statistical receiving categories. In 1946, Thomas was forced to resign as a result of heart and lung disease that developed from his daily smoking habits. Shortly after, they continued to experience success, but eventually suffered a sharp decline, resulting in a winless season in 1955. Following some years of football mediocrity, Alabama officially stepped up to become the powerhouse of college football as a result of legendary head coach Bear Bryant. Bryant actually was nicknamed Bear after agreeing to wrestle a captive bear when he was just 13 years old. He was a star defensive end and actually played alongside Don Hudson when the school claimed a national championship in 1934. Bear got into coaching and eventually became the head coach at Maryland, Kentucky, and Texas A&M before landing back at his alma mater. Bryant is known for his difficult training camps and practices that resulted in dozens of players quitting the team. Bryant led Alabama to 6 national championship titles, with 5 of them being decided by the Associated Press that is well known for conducting pretty accurate scientific polls. Bryant's first national championship came in 1961 when linebacker Leroy Jordan helped lead the team to an undefeated record. 1962 saw the arrival of legendary quarterback Joe Namath, who led the Tide to a 29-4 record over his 3 years, finishing with over 3,000 total yards and 39 total touchdowns. During his tenure, Bryant dealt with Alabama Governor George Wallace's strict stance against integration. He had previously began integrating his teams while at Kentucky and Texas A&M, but was delayed in recruiting African American players due to backlash from Wallace. Eventually, in 1971, Bryant recruited Wilbur Jackson, Alabama's first African American scholarship player, as well as John Mitchell Jr., who became the first African American player for the Crimson Tide. Mitchell himself had said that although he dreamt of playing for Bryant, he never thought it would happen as a result of the strict segregationist policies in place at the time. Mitchell actually went on to become the first African American assistant coach for Alabama. He is now currently the assistant head coach for the Pittsburgh Steelers and has been with the team for the last 27 seasons. After some down years in the late 60s, Bryant got back to his ways of winning 3 more championships before his retirement in 1982. He passed away in 1983 and left his mark on the Tide, securing 232 victories to just 46 losses after coaching for 38 seasons with just 1 losing season. He was a fearsome coach who carefully selected assistants that would remain loyal. Bryant was able to turn average players into great players with a mentality of winning. He is considered one of the greatest college football coaches of all time. His legacy, according to Nick Saban, is that he's the one who made the tradition at Alabama a place where a lot of players wanted to come. Alabama continued to have success and won yet another national championship, with head coach Gene Stallings at the helm. Stallings had actually played under Bear Bryant while at Texas A&M and was the head coach there. In 1990, he was hired to become Alabama's next head coach and led Alabama to a 13-0 record and a national championship in 1992. He resigned in 1997 after an NCAA investigation found out that they were falsifying the eligibility of cornerback Antonio Langham. As a result, they were placed on 3 years probation and lost 30 scholarships over that time period. These sanctions impacted the Tide negatively, as they would suffer from 4 losing seasons over the next decade. In 2007, the Tide were once again sanctioned after an NCAA investigation found that players were receiving improper benefits. Essentially, athletes were receiving textbooks for classes they were not taking, and were possibly selling them on the side. This resulted in Alabama losing all 10 of their victories from the 2005 season, and 6 of their victories from the 2006 season, as they were vacated from their all-time record. After failing to make an impact at the NFL level, Nick Saban announced that he would become the 27th head coach at Alabama. Before he had arrived, he had coached at Michigan State, LSU, and had won the BCS National Championship for the Tigers in 2003. Prior to these positions, he was the defensive coordinator with the Cleveland Browns under head coach Bill Belichick, where he learned and developed a friendship with the eventual 6-time Super Bowl winning coach. After coaching the Dolphins to a 15-17 record over 2 seasons, he made his return to collegiate coaching. Saban took over the job looking to bring greatness back to the Alabama program and start a dynasty of his own. Before we get into the overview of the seasons, it is important to point out that Nick Saban is very good at recruiting. In 2008, the NCAA announced a rule change that prevented head coaches from evaluating recruits on the road during the spring evaluation period. This became known as the Saban rule, as he fervently traveled across the country to meet and possibly land top recruits. He is able to build strong relationships with his potential recruits. In my opinion, if you want to be a great coach, you also need to be great at recruiting, and Saban has an ability to recognize talent. According to the class of 2013 recruit Jonathan Allen, Nick Saban turned down a home-cooked meal because he had already eaten. Allen respected this decision, as he said that Saban did not promise Allen a thing, but instead treated Allen like an adult. His extensive recruiting techniques and time devoted to recruiting has truly made him one of the best. Saban's wife, Terry, has also played a role in welcoming and developing relationships with these players in order to have their parents feel more comfortable with them attending college in Tuscaloosa. Now, let's get back to it. Saban experienced a mediocre first season, finishing 6-6, that included an embarrassing loss to Louisiana Monroe. Despite the unimpressive season, Saban began to land some huge recruits from the class of 2008 to officially begin his long-standing dynasty. These recruits included Falcons star receiver Julio Jones, 2009 Heisman winner Mark Ingram, defensive end Marcel Darius, and linebacker Donta Hightower, just to name a few. With these recruits ready to make an impact, Saban turned the program around in just 1 year, finishing with a 12-2 record, losing only to the Tim Tebow-led Florida Gators, who went on to win the national championship, as well as the Utah Utes in the Sugar Bowl. His success led to him winning several Coach of the Year awards. In 2009, Alabama, led by running backs Mark Ingram and Trent Richardson, accumulated an undefeated record that included a huge victory over Tim Tebow and the Gators in the SEC Championship, and a BCS National Championship victory over Colt McCoy and the Texas Longhorns. Ingram went on to become Alabama's first ever Heisman winner after posting 1,658 rushing yards and 20 total touchdowns. During the 2011 season, the Tide rolled past their opponents, finishing 12-1. They soundly defeated the LSU Tigers 21-0 in the BCS Championship game. The following year, they went on to win their second straight BCS Championship by defeating the Fighting Irish 42-14. A.J. McCarron stepped up at the quarterback position, finishing with 30 touchdowns to just 3 interceptions. The running back tandem of Eddie Lacy and T.J. Yeldon combined for more than 2,700 total yards and 32 total touchdowns. Saban followed the season up with an impressive 2013 recruiting class that saw him land the best running back in the nation in Derrick Henry, along with linebacker Reuben Foster, defensive end Jonathan Allen, and tight end O.J. Howard. Believe it or not, Alvin Kamara was also signed to be a part of this class, but he eventually transferred to Tennessee later in his career. The 2013 season prevented Alabama from playing in the SEC Championship due to the infamous Kick 6 that resulted in an Auburn victory in the Iron Bowl. FSU, led by Jameis Winston, went on to defeat the Tigers in the championship game, whereas Alabama suffered a crushing 45-31 defeat against the underdog Oklahoma Sooners. In 2014, Bama was ready to compete for yet another championship victory, but suffered a huge midseason loss to Ole Miss. The season ended in the college football playoff semifinals, when the number 1 seed Alabama fell to a surprising Ohio State team led by third-string quarterback Cardale Jones and running back Ezekiel Elliott. In 2015, Saban and the Tide won yet another national championship, defeating Clemson 45-40. Derrick Henry became the second Bama player to win the Heisman after rushing for 2,219 yards and an outstanding 28 touchdowns. After this season, longtime defensive coordinator Kirby Smart, who had become the highest-paid defensive coordinator in college football due to his consistent defensive success, left to return to become the head coach at his alma mater, Georgia. The 2016 season saw yet another appearance in the national championship game against Deshaun Watson and the Clemson Tigers. Despite the fact that Alabama, led by quarterback Jalen Hurts and running back Bo Scarborough, were leading 24-14 at the end of the third quarter, the Crimson Tide blew this lead, eventually falling 35-31. This would be Saban's first loss in the college football playoffs. Now that we're in the year 2017, we can now finally talk about the formation of this championship team. Saban's recruits come to Alabama expecting to go through rigorous training that pays off with possible national championships and preparedness for the NFL. This type of trade-off has helped Alabama continuously dominate the recruiting boards. The 2017 Alabama recruiting class may go down as the greatest recruiting class of all time. This class has accumulated an overall of 50-4 over their 4 seasons. They had 4 top 5 Heisman finishers that include Devontae Smith, Mac Jones, Najee Harris, and Tua Tagovailoa. This class also included offensive tackle Alex Leatherwood, linebacker Dylan Moses, as well as receivers Jerry Jeudy and Henry Ruggs. In other words, this class was absolutely stacked. Led by sophomore Jalen Hurts, the Tide went 11-1 in the regular season and found themselves facing off against the Clemson Tigers in the college football playoff semifinals. This time, Hurts and the Tide would have the upper hand. Nick Saban and the Crimson Tide then went on to face off against the Kirby Smart-led Georgia Bulldogs in the national championship. Bama's offense failed to get much going in the first half, and they trailed 13-0 heading into the locker rooms. Saban made a significant change during the break to put in true freshman Tua Tagovailoa into the game. Despite a slow first drive, Tua brought the offense alive, using his arms and his legs to propel them to their first touchdown. Following a series of field goals, Alabama elected to go for it on 4th down, resulting in a 7-yard touchdown reception from Calvin Ridley to tie up the game. The game eventually went to overtime, tied 20 apiece. After a Rodrigo Blankenship field goal, Tua, following a huge sack, threw a 41-yard bomb to fellow true freshman Devontae Smith to capture Saban's 5th title with the Crimson Tide. Saban continued to have recruiting success, especially in the class of 2018, as he was able to land star cornerback Patrick Surtain, as well as receiver Jalen Waddle, key pieces on their 2020 championship team. During this offseason, defensive coordinator Jeremy Pruitt was hired to become the head coach at Tennessee, with Pete Golding replacing him. The offense with Tua at the helm came alive during the 2018 season. With current Maryland head coach Mike Locksley as the offensive coordinator, the Crimson Tide averaged 45.6 points per game. This was Saban's first top 10 scoring offense while at Alabama. True freshman Jalen Waddle, aforementioned Ruggs, and Judy were the top receivers, while linebacker Dylan Moses led the team in tackles. This team was very good throughout the season, thoroughly dominating their SEC opponents. Tagovailoa had an impressive sophomore season, finishing with over 3,500 total yards and 42 total touchdowns. However, after Tua suffered an injury in the SEC championship game against Georgia, it was Hurts who stepped up to lead the Tide to a 35-28 victory. The success ran out for the Crimson Tide as they suffered a humiliating 44-16 loss against Clemson in the national championship. For reference, the last time they had lost by a margin this bad, Bill Clinton was still the president. Defensive struggles and inconsistencies from Tua hurt the team, but they were more than ready to bounce back in 2019. After the 2018 season, Nick Saban rehired Steve Sarkisian to become the offensive coordinator. Sarkisian had served as an analyst during the 2016 season and was actually the offensive coordinator during their 2016 championship loss to Clemson following Lane Kiffin's departure. The 2019 season saw some disappointments from Alabama, as it appeared that the dynasty would be coming to an end. After winning their first 7 games, Tua suffered a high ankle sprain. Mac Jones, the long-term backup, replaced him and led the Tide to an impressive 48-7 victory in his first start. 2 weeks later, Tua returned post-surgery to face off against the number 1 team in the country and the eventual national champions, the LSU Tigers, led by the eventual Heisman winner Joe Burrow. Despite a strong second half, Tua's early turnovers were too much to overcome, and LSU defeated the Crimson Tide 46-41 in what has been called the game of the century. Misfortune continued to strike for Alabama as Tua suffered a season-ending hip injury and was replaced by Mac Jones in a game against Mississippi State. While Jones looked great as a starter, a few weeks later in the Iron Bowl, Jones fought hard, throwing for 335 yards and 4 touchdowns. However, they fell to Auburn after a missed field goal that resulted in a 48-45 win for the Tigers. The 2-loss regular season prevented an SEC championship appearance and kept the Tide out of the playoffs for the first time since it was created in 2014. They faced off and soundly defeated the Michigan Wolverines 35-16 in the 2020 Citrus Bowl. The team felt disrespected, and they were eager to prove that they were better than their eventual number 8 ranking at the end of the season. In March, the coronavirus spread quickly throughout the United States, eventually reaching the levels of a pandemic. Due to uncertainties and confusion surrounding the virus, stay-at-home orders were put in place in several states. Colleges across the nation sent their students home and canceled in-person classes. As a result, all collegiate sports were suspended as well. After several months of quarantine, the SEC decided that they would try and play football this fall. They were the first conference to allow student athletes back on campus for voluntary workouts at the start of June. These practices were under strict supervision, and players were required to receive testing multiple times before partaking in any activities. When Alabama players arrived on campus to participate in these practices, there were reports that at least 5 players had contracted the virus. In August, amidst speculation over whether sports were safe to resume, Saban advocated for a season to be played, noting that the team's positivity rate since the 4th of July was at just 2%. Alex Leatherwood, Alabama's star offensive tackle, stated that they had been grinding all summer, and they don't want their hard work to be all for nothing. Saban said that if players aren't allowed to play, then we shouldn't be having school in person. Besides the bonds and relationships that formed through these practices and off-season workouts, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement following the death of George Floyd helped the team bond in a whole new way. These players were already dealing with the struggles of living in a pandemic world where there was depressing news almost every day. However, with the rise of the Black Lives movement and full support from head coach Nick Saban, the players developed a unique relationship with one another, as well as their head coach. Saban had set up Zoom calls with influential African Americans such as Condoleezza Rice and Charles Barkley to speak to the team about the current issues facing the United States today. Prior to the season, Najee Harris organized a march to the Foster Auditorium, where Governor George Wallace had stood nearly 60 years ago to deny entrance to an African American student. Nick Saban was right alongside him the entire march, as he has repeatedly stressed that he will always put his players and their needs first before anything else. These incredible and unique bonds formed during such a difficult time, and a desire to win yet another national championship served as key driving factors for this team heading into the 2020 season. At the end of July, it was announced that the SEC would play a 10-game, conference-only schedule to eliminate contacts with teams outside of the conference. With less games to play, the Tide were dialed in and ready to go. Now, let's take a quick look at some of their key pieces. Following the departure of Tua Tagovailoa to the NFL, longtime backup Mac Jones was ready to lead the Tide to a championship victory. Jones, who had been part of the 2017 recruiting class, had originally committed to play for Kentucky after a successful high school career at the Bulls School. He showed early signs of greatness after a 2-touchdown performance in Alabama's 2018 A-Day game. He had some appearances during the 2018 season, but it was the 2019 season that really provided Jones with the experience he needed in order to help lead Alabama to success. After beating out 5-star quarterback Bryce Young for the top job, he used his experience and leadership to guide an explosive offense. Najee Harris, who had an impressive 2019 season, finishing with a total of 1,528 yards and 20 touchdowns, was featured as a key running back after announcing he would return to deal with unfinished business. Devontae Smith, the former 4-star receiver out of Amite City, Louisiana, decided to return for his senior year in order to complete his degree. Had Alabama been more successful the previous season, some of their stars may have elected to opt out for the season and instead prepare for the draft. Instead, they stayed to pursue yet another national championship. On September 26th, the Tide opened their season in a dominant 38-19 victory over the Missouri Tigers, with 13 of the Tigers' points coming in the fourth quarter against Alabama backups. Waddle was the star of the show, finishing with 134 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Arguably one of Alabama's hardest opponents of the season came Week 2 against Texas A&M. After the Aggies tied at 14-all in the second quarter, the Tide ran away with it, scoring 21 straight points thanks to Mac Jones' passing attack, as well as a Daniel Wright pick six. Bama went on to win the game 52-24. The following week, Ole Miss tried its best to stay close with Alabama. They were tied 42-all early in the fourth quarter, but eventually the offensive dominance of the Tide overpowered the Ole Miss defense that ultimately fell 48-63. Najee Harris ran all over Ole Miss, finishing with 206 yards and 5 touchdowns. On October 14th, it was announced that Saban had tested positive for COVID and was sent home. Fortunately, after just a few days at home, it was determined to have been a false positive test, and he was able to return the morning of the Georgia game to coach his team. Bama struggled in the first half and went on into the break down 24-20. However, defensive adjustments made by Saban helped them secure a huge 41-24 victory. The following week, during a 48-17 victory over Tennessee, star receiver Jalen Waddle suffered an ankle injury that kept him out up until the national championship game. Despite losing one of their star players, they continued to have success, as Devontae Smith was allowed to have even more targets, and his statistics steadily increased throughout the rest of the season. The following week, Smith had a 4-touchdown, 203-yard receiving performance in a dominant 41-0 victory over Mississippi State. The defense, led by Dylan Moses and Malachi Moore, played outstanding, allowing just 200 total yards of offense. Alabama improved to 7 wins after a dominant 63-3 victory over the Kentucky Wildcats. Before Alabama's Iron Bowl matchup against Auburn, the team was faced with another onslaught of challenges after Nick Saban had to be quarantined as a result of his COVID-19 testing positive this time. Despite quarantining from home, he was able to utilize Zoom to watch team practices from his home and participate in coaching meetings. He wasn't, however, allowed to contact any of his assistants during the game. Offensive coordinator Sarkisian stepped up to lead the Tide to a huge 42-13 victory over their in-state rivals, whom they had fallen to the year before. Alabama played LSU in early December after their game had been postponed due to a coronavirus outbreak at LSU. Alabama wasted no time defeating the Tigers 55-17 in a revenge game against a helpless LSU team. Najee Harris ran all over the Tigers, rushing for 145 yards and 3 touchdowns, while Devontae Smith recorded 8 receptions for 231 yards and 3 touchdowns. A week later, the Tide wasted no time defeating the Arkansas Razorbacks by a score of 52-3 before they turned their attention to the Florida Gators. The Gators have recently lost an embarrassing 37-34 game against the struggling LSU team. This was a result of Marco Wilson throwing a shoe up in the air, which ultimately gave LSU the field position they needed to kick the game-winning field goal. This blunder basically kept them out of the college football playoffs. However, they looked to defeat Alabama in the SEC championship. Alabama let a big first-half lead slowly slip away. However, a strong fourth quarter helped them win their closest game of the season. Mac Jones threw for 418 yards and 5 touchdowns to secure a berth in the college football playoffs by defeating the Gators by a score of 52-46. As they approached the college football semifinal, the number 1 seed Alabama was set to face off against the 4th seed, the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. The Irish had previously defeated the Clemson Tigers after Trevor Lawrence missed the game due to a positive COVID result. However, in the ACC Championship, the luck of the Irish ran out as Lawrence was back and soundly defeated the Irish 34-10. Bama opened as 20.5-point favorites, which was the largest ever for a CFP semifinal or national championship game. They actually failed to cover, as the game ended 31-14. Although Notre Dame was able to force a few punts, their offense couldn't get much going, while Devontae Smith cemented himself as the Heisman frontrunner with 7 receptions, 130 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Prior to the college football championship game, it was announced that Alabama had 3 Heisman finalists, in Harris, Jones, and Smith. The award ultimately went to Devontae Smith, who had become the first receiver to win since Desmond Howard. Smith, known for his quiet demeanor and humble personality, had one of the most impressive seasons by a receiver in college football history. Including his stats from the championship game, he finished with 1,856 receiving yards and 24 total touchdowns. He deserved to win the trophy, and, well, he ultimately did. Alabama's season came to a conclusion in New Orleans as they faced off against an Ohio State Buckeyes team that had just thoroughly dominated Trevor Lawrence and the Clemson Tigers. Prior to the season, Ohio State hadn't even been sure if they were going to play during the fall, as the Big Ten worked to decide whether or not they should be allowed to. Prior to the game, there had been reports that the Buckeyes had yet another COVID outbreak and may have had upwards of 20 positive tests. And we saw a pretty quiet first quarter, as the quarter ended tied at 7-7. However, in the second quarter, Alabama quickly began to slip away. Ohio State running back Trey Sermon had been injured, and it was announced that he would not return to the game. This announcement seemingly had an effect on Ohio State as they saw themselves falling behind the Tide. After scoring 28 points in the second quarter, Alabama led 35-17 at the half. Desperate to prevent any type of comeback, they continued to score at a ferocious rate. The defense, led by Chris Barmore, played great, limiting Justin Fields to just 1 touchdown and 261 total yards. The game ended as a 52-24 victory over the Buckeyes. Devontae Smith had himself a night, finishing with 12 receptions for 215 yards and 3 touchdowns, despite only playing for a little more than a half. Mac Jones ensured the offense's success, passing for 464 yards and 5 touchdowns with just 9 incompletions. Nick Saban has now equaled Bear Bryant with 6 national championships while at Alabama. He now has more national championships than the other 129 active FBS coaches combined. That statistic is phenomenal to me. This team set a program record, averaging 48.5 points per game. This was, without a doubt, one of the most impressive and dominant teams we have ever seen throughout a season. With 5 first-team All-Americans, the top offensive line in the nation, a Heisman winner in Devontae Smith, a Davey O'Brien winner in Mac Jones, and a Doak Walker Award winner in Najee Harris, who finished with 1,466 yards and 26 rushing touchdowns, this team clearly racked up lots of hardware and recognition. As Nick Saban stated, I actually think that this year was so much different because it actually made our team closer. When you take something away, you have a greater appreciation when you get it back. I think that players had greater appreciation for the team and the goal that they had. The success of Alabama came from the team. The success of Alabama came from the bond that they formed during these difficult times. Saban believes this adversity helped them form bonds unlike anything he has ever seen. Besides the bond that they were able to form, a lot of credit has to be given to Steve Sarkisian, who led this explosive offense by instilling an RPO offense that involves the quarterback having the ability to either run the ball, give it to the running back, or throw it. Sarkisian is also great at making offensive adjustments by switching up formations to throw the defense off guard. He was eventually awarded the Broyles Award, given to the nation's top coaching assistant due to all his success. Another important factor to the success of this team and their dynasty was Saban's switch from a dominant defensive team to a team with a high-octane offense. While I realized that defense was still important, new teams were winning with high-powered offenses, such as that of the FSU 2013 team led by Jameis Winston that thoroughly dominated their opponents. Alabama's offense was so good, in fact, that they had more touchdowns with 84 than field goals, punts, turnovers, and turnover on downs combined at 62. We may look at LSU's 2019 team as having one of the greatest offenses of all time, but Alabama's 2020 team can definitely put up a fight. Nick Saban changing his system to make it more pass-friendly has created an unstoppable force. This team was also saved by the fact that only one starting player missed a game due to COVID. Other teams throughout college football dealt with serious outbreaks, including several teams in the Big Ten, such as Ohio State, that ended up playing just 8 games this season. Another huge factor for the team was the fact that they finally had a solid kicker. Sophomore Will Reichard went 100% in terms of field goals and extra points this season, fully maximizing the points that Alabama would score this season. Bama fans may remember the 2019 Auburn loss that ended on an Alabama missed field goal. At least for the next couple years, the Crimson Tide has got themselves a solid kicker. In terms of the future, Alabama has recently hired Bill O'Brien to become their next offensive coordinator after Steve Sarkisian left to become the head coach at Texas. In terms of their offense, they will continue to lose some stars, including Devontae Smith and Mac Jones. However, they will have sophomore quarterback Bryce Young to lead the charge. In terms of recruiting, Alabama currently has the top recruiting class from the class of 2021, and I expect as long as they continue to win, they won't be slowing down anytime soon. This concludes our short documentary on how Alabama was able to win the national championship during one of the worst pandemics our world has ever seen in the last 100 years. Why do you think Alabama was able to win it? Leave your thoughts and start some arguments in the comment section below. As always, remember to subscribe, turn on post notifications so you never miss another great video.